up until more recent times, right? And it's not exactly the ocean anymore. I've put this picture up here because this is a picture by Maxwell Spencer Dupain. It's called Sunbaker. And this is probably, it's hard to say these sorts of things, but probably the most famous Australian photograph ever taken. Certainly famous within Australia. And it's reflective of Australians' more modern interest in not exactly the ocean, but the edge of the ocean, the beach, right? Beach culture has become an incredibly big part of Australia. It's become a big part of their tourist appeal, and it's become a big part of the lifestyle of the people who live in Australia. So people are writing increasingly about the beach, not about the desert where all their money is coming from now, but about the beach where they have this source of fun and they can go and frolic. One of my favorite Australian writers is a man by the name of Tim Winton, and he writes incredibly beautiful books, many of which are about the beach. Tim Winton is fascinated with surfing, and this comes from a novel he wrote that really is all about surfing. It's called Breath, and it was published in 2008. This is, I think, a gorgeous evocation of surfing. From the granite headland, whose rocks were daubed with warnings about the dangerous current, the beach stretched east for miles. We watched the surfers plunge into a churning rip alongside the rocks, and from there they shot out toward the break. Waves ground around the headland, line upon line of them, smooth and turquoise, reeling across the bay to spend themselves in a final mauling rush against the bar at the river mouth. The air seethed with noise and salt. I was giddy with it. I couldn't have put words to it as a boy, but later I understood what seized my imagination that day, how strange it was to see men do something beautiful, something pointless and elegant, as though nobody saw or cared. In Sawyer, a town of millers and loggers and dairy farmers, with one butcher and a rep from the rural bank beside the BP, men did solid, practical things, mostly with their hands. Perhaps a baker might have had a chance to make something as pretty as it was tasty, but our baker was a woman anyway, a person as dour and blunt as any boy's father, and she baked loaves like house bricks. For all those years when Looney and I surfed together, having caught the bug that first morning at the point, we never spoke about the business of beauty. We were mates, but there were places our conversation simply couldn't go. There was never any doubt about the primary thrill of surfing, the huge body rush we got flying down the line with the wind in our ears. We didn't know what endorphins were, but we quickly understood how narcotic the feeling was and how addictive it became. From day one, I was stoned just from watching. We talked about skill and courage and luck. We shared all that, and in time, we surfed to fool with death. But for me, there was still the outlaw feeling of doing something graceful, as if dancing on water was the best and bravest thing a man could do. I think that's beautiful. All right, so moving on from the beach, or from the ocean, we're going to talk about bush and jungle, jungle and bush. It's probably important to note here, I wrote my abstract or summary for this speech, sent it off to the people who deal with those things, and then I showed it to my wife much later. My wife is Australian, and she said to me, "We don't call it the jungle, we call it the rainforest." I said, "Oh, of course, I'm so sorry." So let's start with the jungle or the rainforest. The jungle is strangely something that Australian writers almost never write about. There's one Australian writer, I was racking my brain for Australian writers who write about the jungle. Thea Astley, a woman who lives in Queensland again, and lived in the jungle, in the rainforest, and wrote extensively about it. But beyond her, very little writing about the rainforest. If I had to make a prediction for the future of Australian literature's fascination with the landscape, I would predict that at some point in the next decade or two, that Australian writers will write with increasing frequency about this landscape, for the reason that it's something that brings people to Australia. People are interested in the rainforest. They have quite a unique rainforest in Australia, and people travel there increasingly. So its cultural value is on the rise, and I think we'll see that reflected in the literature of that place. The bush, on the other hand, is something that Australian writers write about all the time and have been writing about since the very beginning. Now, bush is a funny word and not one that's particularly familiar to Americans. We, of course, know a bush as like something this size, right, that's outside our house, decorative. but it means something different in Australia, and it's very difficult to pin down. In fact, I suspect that part of the fascination that Australian writers have with the bush is that it's a kind of vernacular term. So not only is the landscape itself unique to Australia, but the term itself is unique to Australia. And they like that vernacular term. They're able to gain some sort of, there's some sort of notion of identity that's wrapped up with the term itself. Bush means something like forest, countryside, outdoors, scrubby lands. It's not the desert, it's not the outback, right? It's something in between that's undefinable even by Australians. But again, it's something that Australians have been fascinated with. I wanted to give you another picture of the bush to illustrate just how diverse a term this really is. This is, of course, pasture land here, but that down there is the bush, and the pasture land was carved out of the bush. Someone might still write, though, of this pasture land as the bush. The term is very hazy. I want to go back to an early Australian writer for an image of the bush. Specifically, I want to go back to Banjo Patterson, who many of you would have heard of. He's the author of Waltzing Matilda. A.B. Banjo Patterson. He wrote one poem in 1889 called Clancy of the Overflow, where he depicts the speaker in the poem is sitting in an office building fantasizing about the bush. In my wild, erratic fancy visions come to me of Clancy gone a-drovin' down by the Cooper, where the western drovers go. As the stock are slowly stringing, Clancy rides behind them singing, for the drover's life has pleasures that the townsfolk never know. And the bush hath friends to meet him, and their kindly voices greet him in the morning, in the murmur of the breezes and the river on its bar, and he sees the vision splendid of the sunlit plains extended, and at night the wondrous glory of the everlasting stars. I'm going to skip to the end. And I somehow rather fancy that I'd like to change with Clancy, like to take a turn at droving where the seasons come and go, while he faced the round eternal of the cash book and the journal, but I doubt he'd suit the office, Clancy of the Overflow. A kind of romantic image of the bush there. Those sort of romantic images of the bush were so common in that early period of Australian literature. When I say early period, we have to keep in mind Australia was colonized in the 1780s. Australian literature really didn't flourish until the late 1800s, so it's a relatively recent history. Those evocations of the bush were so common in this period, those romantic images of the bush, that you had writers responding antagonistically to them. So I want to read something from Henry Lawson, where he kind of has a go at writers like Banjo Patterson and their romantic image of the bush. Henry Lawson writes in a poem called Up the Country, I am back from up the country, very sorry that I went, seeking for the southern poet's land whereon to pitch my tent. I have lost a lot of idols which were broken on the track, burnt a lot of fancy verses, and I'm glad that I am back. Further out may be the pleasantest scenes of which our poets boast, but I think the country's rather more inviting round the coast. Anyway, I'll stay at present at a boarding house in town, drinking beer and lemon squashes, taking baths and cooling down. Sunny plains, great Scott, those burning wastes of barren soil and sand with their everlasting fences stretching out across the land, desolation where the crow is, desert where the eagle flies, paddocks where the loony bullock starts and stares with reddened eyes, where, in clouds of dust enveloped, roasted bullock drivers creep slowly past the sun-dried shepherd dragging behind his crawling sheep. Stunted peak of granite gleaming, glaring like a molten mass, turned from some infernal furnace on a plain devoid of grass. So yes, the romantic image of the bush and then the response to that. Speaking of responses to the romantic image of the bush, we come to the last two landscapes that I'm going to talk about tonight. And they are the suburb and the city. These were not of interest to writers in the 1890s when Henry Lawson and Banjo Patterson were writing. However, they became of greater interest in the 1950s, roughly, and have continued to be a subject of interest since then. Perhaps in the 1890s and the early 1900s, they were viewed as simply mundane, as nothing special, certainly as the cities and suburbs of Australia couldn't compete with the cities of Europe, and so they weren't written about. But then in the 1950s, Australian writers started to recognize something unique in their cities and suburbs. First, it says both of them. That's not supposed to happen. First, cities. This is a picture of Perth on the west coast, where I spent 5 years and where my wife is from. It's a beautiful city. This is about 10 steps down from where my wife lived before we were married, so a pretty place. First of all, about Australian cities, something that many Americans don't realize is how highly urbanized Australia is as a country. 88% of Australians live in cities and towns. It's one of the most highly urbanized countries in the world. 60% of Australians live in one of 5 of the major cities. 60% of Australians in just 5 major cities. And really, one of the most telling statistics I can give you about Australia and its urbanization is to tell you that 80% of Australians live within an hour's drive of the coast, right? Now, that doesn't specifically say that they live in cities, but if they're living on the coast, chances are they live in cities. The Australian cities ring the coast. Here's, I guess I have one more map, right? My wife is right. Here's a map of the world taken of the night sky, a kind of composite image of the night sky with all the clouds wiped clean. You can just barely glimpse Australia down here, dot, 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 right? Just 5 dots of light. Those are those 5 major cities where 60% of Australians live. And there's a poem that was written that refers to those 5 cities, and I'll see if you can catch it. I think it's quite a nice image. A.D. Hope was a poet born in the early 1900s. In 1939, he wrote a poem called Australia that I'll read from. A nation of trees, drab green and desolate gray, in the field uniform of modern wars, darkens her hills, those endless outstretched paws of sphinx demolished or stone lion worn away. They call her a young country, but they lie. She is the last of lands, the emptiest, a woman beyond her change of life, a breast still tender, but within the womb as dry. And her 5 cities, like 5 teeming sores, each drains her, a fast parasite robber state where second-hand Europeans pullulate timidly on the edge of alien shores. So there's a memorable image of the Australian city as a teeming sore. I rather like that, actually. Pullulate. That's a great question. It's vaguely like pulsate, but it's someone want to help me out with a better definition than that? Mark? Linguist? Pullulate? It's a motion like this, I believe. That's my explanation. You can go home and check that. The Australian suburb. This is taken from my brother-in-law's street, looking across the suburb that he lives in. I'm not a big fan of the suburb that he lives in. It's not my favorite place in the world. But this is a very typical image of an Australian suburb. Those tile roofs, many of them red. That's a very typical thing when you fly in over Australian cities, especially Perth, where I lived. You look down on a sea of red roofs. This is a picture of the house that I lived in for at least, I guess, 4 of the years that I was in Perth. A different kind of suburb than the one that my brother-in-law lives in. Believe it or not, this has nothing to do with literature. This is just background and culture. Believe it or not, this house is in one of the most desirable suburbs in Perth. Perth's a city of nearly 2 million people. And this is a desirable suburb because it's close to the city center. So it's not very far out at all. I could get on a bike and ride like smack into the middle of the city within 10 minutes. I could also get on a bike and ride to the river in about 2 minutes or ride to the ocean in about another 10 minutes. So it was a very desirable place to live. This house here, which was 2 bedrooms, and you can tell it's not the fanciest place in the world, was assessed by a real estate agent while I was living there at $900,000. Yes. Australian real estate prices are incredibly overpriced. In America, the average house price is 3 times the average annual salary. In Australia, the average house price is 7 times the average annual salary. House prices are extraordinary, and yet everyone's obsessed in Australia, as they are in the United States, with owning a house. And so out of that desire to own a house, to have some land, to have a place that we call our own, this fascination with suburbs has arisen, and Australian writers have picked up on it. Like their interest in the city, it's something that's come more recently. Australian suburbs have evolved into more interesting places, and Australian writers have consequently followed behind and tried to represent that. So what I want to do is read, this is my last reading, another Australian poem, apologies to the people who don't like poetry, that captures, I think, the spirit of the Australian suburb. This was published in 1980. It's by William Grano. It's called The Way We Live Now. Hear the talks of flowering annuals, investments. Ah, the richness of our soil. Each morning, automatic sprinklers bless all that's governable and nice. Sleek insects fatten on our ceaseless flowers. Glistening motors roam the land. In our desirable brick and tiles, we dream of real estate. As a final slide, I wanted to point out what's available on this topic, what UWSP offers for people who are interested in learning more about these topics. I teach a course, English 383, Themes in Literature, Australian Literature. My department lets me teach it on occasion. Rest assured, your tax dollars are not going to support someone to teach Australian literature very often. There's not a great demand for it. But sometimes. There's a course on post-colonial literature in English, which occasionally covers Australian writers. But these are, I think, 2 of the more interesting opportunities that UWSP offers if people are interested in Australian literature. There's a semester-long study abroad program where you enroll directly at Macquarie University in Sydney. And then there's also a winterim study abroad program, which is running for the first time, I believe, this winter. And it's through the Comm department, and it's called Communication and Social Change. And that's taking place in Australia. And it's a fascinating program. They have a fascinating winterim planned for those students who are going along with that. So that's all that I have. So if you have any questions, I will take questions now.
Can you name, please, those 5 cities?
Name the 5 cities? Yes, there's Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Perth. That's fine.
How did you get the house if it's
The owner of the house had a sentimental attachment to it. It was his grandparents' house, and he didn't want to sell it, but he didn't really know what to do with it, so he rented it out to us, and he didn't know the real estate prices. So. Yes.
What's the population of Australia?
It's 20 million. So the United States is something like 300 million, something like that. 20 million, yes, it's much smaller.